Okay, we're going to start taking our street art character and we're actually going to make it into a sculpture. Now, what I'm hoping by now is that you've had the opportunity to visualize your sculpture and you've drawn your character in 3 different views. So from the front view and from the back view and from the side view, just to in your mind to think about how you're going to make something that's flat and 2-dimensional and turn it into something that's 3-dimensional. I also was hoping that you had the opportunity to try some online 3D modeling tools. So we were using Sculpting because it works on Chromebook, just to have a taste of what 3D modeling is. There's lots more programs that are way better, more high tech, but this works with Chromebook because these are ways, it's like virtually sculpting on the computer and using clay. So it's good practice for actually using clay, but to think about how things are 3D printed or how they do 3D modeling for video games and animation. So it's pretty cool and you can do some really neat stuff. So hopefully you've had a chance just to experiment with that now. Okay, now we're actually just going to talk about sculpting your actual sculpture. So you have everything that you need in your art kits that you got before the break. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything left for me. I went to all the Dollaramas and there was nothing left. So I'm sorry that I don't actually have I wanted to do actual demo for you, but I went back to Dollarama and they hadn't restocked any of their shelves, and I don't know what's open right now. So I'm just going to give you some tips and tricks. So you are going to do your best with this, and I know it's going to turn out really great. So we're using air dry clay because obviously right now we don't have access to a kiln, but that's okay. But the air dry clay actually works pretty good, and when it dries it actually does take the paint really well. So in your kit I've given you a piece of parchment paper, so that is just to make sure that when you're doing your sculpture that everything that you do is going to be on your sculpture there. So when you're not doing anything on a table, so it doesn't stick to your table or anything. I totally just didn't order skip the dishes. It was just delivered. Bad. Okay. A couple other tips. With your clay, when you're working with it, if you're finding that it's starting to crack a lot and you can't like smooth, like mold it anymore, that means it's starting to get too dry. That's just because when you're working with it in your hands, a lot of the moisture is getting absorbed into your hands. So if that's the case, you just got to dip your fingers in a little bit of water and just work it into the clay. So don't put too much water, like you're not dipping your clay in the water, just your fingers, just a little bit into water, and then work it in. Okay. Now, if your clay gets too wet, you know it's too wet because it starts sticking to your hands and you're not able to like mold it. So if that's the case, no big deal. You just get to keep working with it in your hands and it'll start to dry out a little bit more. Okay, so when it comes out of the package, it probably is a little bit more damp, so you probably do need to work with it a little bit. Okay, so this is really important because when clay dries, it actually is going to shrink. So when you are working with your clay, it shouldn't be any parts that you have, like if you have horns coming off or arms or legs or anything, it shouldn't be any thinner than the thickness of a pinky. So because it will shrink, and if it's too thin and then when it dries and it shrinks, it'll become too brittle and it will just break off. Okay, so when you are doing like arms and legs and horns and anything that's thinner that comes off, you need to make it thicker anyway, just to make it more stable. But that's generally the rule for that. Now, when you're attaching 2 pieces of clay together, there's a few things that you need to keep in mind. For example, say I was building a snowman out of clay and that was my character, my sculpture. So I just make my 3, snowballs, right, and I attach them together. So when the clay is wet, it seems like they're attached together. But what happens is when clay dries, it shrinks. So when the parts of my snowman are starting to shrink, they'll actually separate from each other, and then I'm just going to end up with 3 snowballs as opposed to a big snowman. So when I'm putting my clay together to attach it, my advice is to take a little bit of water and in between the 2 pieces I want to attach, and that will actually act a little bit like glue. And also I should smooth both parts of that clay actually together. So I can actually smooth the 2 parts of the clay together by pushing it down and smoothing it together. Or what I could do if I was making a snowman is I would roll a little small snaky This is back to like your kindergarten days, and actually put it around it and smooth it right in there so it really makes a firm grip. So worst case scenario is that it does separate and it falls apart. Not a big deal. I'll just glue it together when it dries with a glue gun. So, but it's easier if you obviously prevent that. Okay. Now, another thing is that wet clay can only be attached to other wet clay. So wet clay won't stick to dry clay. It will just fall right off. So if I'm doing my sculpture today and I don't have time to finish it all in one day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I'm going to put it in the Ziploc bag that I gave you and seal it. So when I come back to my work in progress tomorrow, that it's still nice and wet and I can still keep working with it. Okay. And also with your unused clay that you have, make sure that I gave you 2 Ziploc bags. So make sure you put your unused clay into a Ziploc bag so it doesn't dry out, so it's still workable. Okay. What else? Oh, arms and legs. If your sculpture has like arms or legs or horns or anything that's coming off, what I recommend is that you kind of reinforce it with the wire that I gave you. So I gave you a pair of pliers and I gave you like a piece of wire. So if you're making arms or anything like that, so I would cut it the length that you need it and then bend it the shape that you have it. And then you're going to have that inside of your clay. So you'd wrap your clay around it and still the same thing. Make sure that the thickness is no thinner than the width of your pinky, even if it's around the clay, because it'll shrink. Okay, so just like for your arms and everything, so fold it the shape that you need it and actually wrap the clay around it, and then you can insert it into your body. And that'll just make it a lot stronger and hold the shape a lot better as it dries. Okay, make it more sturdy. I'm even thinking too, like about the legs, what I even would recommend is for the legs and the feet, just to make it more sturdy. Like for your feet, I would actually make an L shape and then wrap the clay around that, and that'll give it extra strength because the body is going to be sitting on top of that, right? Just to hold the weight for that. So that's what I would do. You do have a pair of pliers, so we were lucky that I had enough pliers for everybody in the class. So most of you got needle nose pliers, and some of you just had other kinds of pliers. So both are fine, but in case you've never used pliers before, there's a little part sort of here in the middle, and that's where you snip the wires, and then you can use the end to sort of bend it to any shape that you need. You can, use your hands because it's not terribly thick wire, but it might hurt your fingers, so it might be better with using your pliers. So even what I would even suggest too is if you are using, I don't know, say you're using a piece of wire for a hand that's coming out, what I would even recommend actually at the end of the wire is you can just fold it around so it doesn't like stick out of your clay. What else? Oh, I did give you some one whole sculpting tool, so that's all we had. But really, your fingers are the best tools for this project, okay? To kind of, roll everything around, smooth things out, and, pinch and pull, just like you did on Sculpt That online when you're playing with the clay. So you can use a clay tool, is really useful if you want to get into like details and kind of smush things. But sometimes what I use too is even just like the tip of a pen or a pencil, just if you want to get into like the fine details, if you're doing like facial features or anything that your finger's not going to fit in, a pencil just works fine. Or if you have a toothpick or whatever that you have there. Okay. Okay, when you're done, so it's air dry clay, so we don't need to fire this. And when it dries, it just takes, when you're done, you just let it sit out. Okay, so take it out of the bag, just let it sit out, let it dry, just air dry. And it should really only take a couple of days. It actually dries pretty well. So again, if anything breaks off, no big deal. We can glue gun it. We've used white glue before. It works fine, so don't worry about it. Of course, you're going to photograph it and put it on your digital portfolio. I was sort of envisioning that we would paint these as well, because actually this air dry clay actually does take paint really well, like acrylic paint. But of course, we're not in school right now, so we don't have that acrylic paint. If you have acrylic paint at home and you want to go ahead and paint it, do it. If you have it, go ahead, but don't feel that you have to go run to the dollar store or Curry's or anything and buy paint. to paint it. Don't stress. I don't know. I don't really think that the watercolor paint will actually stain it a little bit. It might be kind of cool. So you could try that. If you really, because they do look cool painted, like they really do. If you want to, you could even photograph it and put it on an online digital painting program. You could put it on Clecky that we use and actually paint it on there, right? Just put the transparency down a little bit on the paint on your brush and online, and actually it'll paint kind of cool. But the painting part is cool and it would be really neat, but please don't stress about it. Okay, so if you don't have anything to paint it with, then whatever, we won't paint it. And if we have time, if we get to go back to the classroom, we will. Okay, so that's sort of my really horrible demo about how to sculpt without, actually having any clay to show you. I don't even have any Play-Doh anymore in my house to, those days are past. But, the air dry clay does work really well, right? And to be honest, like think about like the textures and stuff on it. Texture looks really cool, especially when you paint it. But just take your time. I mean, here are some really, if you need some inspiration, some cool examples about how you can do this. And again, it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be really simple, and they even turn out really cool. So you've got a great design, your sculpture is going to turn out neat. So I can't wait to see how they're going to turn out. Okay, have fun with it. Good luck.